Well, it's now 10:30, and that means it's time for Brainstorming the Human Connection. It's brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council, and this is a interactive program. And what that means is it's not just talking heads, it's you too. This is a conversational program. We want to encourage everyone to add something to the conversation. Everybody has ideas and experiences and questions, or should have some questions. I believe you have questions, and there are no stupid questions. Um, and well, sometimes there are. Okay, but no, mostly there's no stupid questions, and you won't know until you answer. Ask those questions. If you don't ask the question, it's deprived not only yourself of an answer, but a question that other of us maybe should have asked but didn't. So this is an opportunity for you to, let's say, practice asking questions, practice being in a discussion where there are no real quote experts. That your contribution is always as important as any other person's contribution, and we value that. So we'll ask you to think of questions, and in case you don't think of any, we have had some prompt questions in the chat. Some questions that you might have asked if you had been thinking about it longer. So please feel free to join in the conversation. It's the whole point of this program is to provide a platform where people can exchange in useful information. One of the default, I hesitate to call it a solution, but a go-to resolution that people have in our country, sadly, is violence. Money is one. We always think we can throw money at things, and if we throw money at it, suddenly it's supposed to go away. If we have enough money, we think maybe we could solve it. But sadly, one of the other things that we think of as a solution for every problem is the default of violence. If it starts right from the crib. If you see people that have like a 6-month-old kid doesn't even have language yet, and if the kid's crying or doing something, there is, the way to handle it is to smack the kid one way or another. It's, oh, it's just tapping on the back, on the bottom. Yeah, but, you know, and then it goes right into as they grow up, people, that's what they know to do is to use violence to change people's behavior. And then even in our police force or other things, it always, whether it's the neighbors or our family or whatever, there always seems to be a space for violence as a solution, a default solution. The trump card, or I shouldn't say that. But it's the thing that we always default to. There are some people in this world who are looking for other ways. There are some people in this world who are trying to divert us away from that paradigm. And I should say that many of us don't know that there are actually places in the world where people don't use that as a default. And because we like to think, well, it's human nature. Well, not so fast. There are cultures in which even the police are reticent to use violence, and they have other ways to disarm and, de-escalate and stuff like that. There are other cultures who have internal mechanisms and the way they interact with each other where they don't have the level of violence. I won't say there's any place where nobody ever commits violence, but I can say that is nothing like what we have in this country. And as there are people who are trying to do something about that violence, I think it's a good place for us to start to reverse that trend is to reach out to those people and look at what they're doing and look at what their efforts are to turn us away from our default solution of violence. And today, We have as our guest Tanya, and I should have asked you. I'm probably going to mangle your name again, but Grassel-Krietlow.
It's actually Tanya
Uh-huh.
Grassel-Krietlow. Yeah.
Krietlow. Okay. If I could have said it worse, probably, it would have taken practice. But we got it
Oh,
now. Grassel-Krietlow.
you'd be surprised.
um, and she is a program coordinator with the South Dakota Network Against Family Violence and Sexual Assault. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'm one for one now. um, oh, one for two. Anyway, we're going to be having a conversation about what the network, the South Dakota Network, is doing. And so, thank you very much, Tanya, for joining our conversation and our brainstorming session this morning. Let me start off by asking you to give us some background of about you, so that we know who we're talking to. What are the things that brings you to this position that's so important in what we have to do to build our society today?
Thank you. As I said, my name is Tanya. I am from the Lower Brule Reservation here in South Dakota. I graduated from high school in Chamberlain, and after college, entered into a very microcosm of direct services at a boarding school. And so learned about how to unpack the generational trauma that our grandmothers and some of our parents had in a boarding school, and now how we use that as a tool to keep our youth safe because of violence or situations either in the community or at home. And then went into law enforcement, went into Indian Health Service. I was an educator at a Lower Brule Community College for adult learners in the human services world. Learned how to write and manage grants in both the spaces. And then I find myself as a grant manager or a program manager with the network, as he said. So I come to the network with over 30 years of experience working with Native American families, both on and off the reservation. 74% of us live off reservation now, so it's important to have good cultural responsiveness in agencies that serve us off the reservation, as well as stay in touch with our tribal partners because of the natural nomadic lifestyle and ebb and flow of those of us who routinely feel the tug of the reservation and go home. So my role now is to write grants and manage grants so that our tribal partners and our agencies that serve a high number of Native Americans are able to do their job with all the training, skills, and employees they need to address violence in South Dakota.
Great. Give us the 50,000-foot view of where particularly family violence stands right now. Where have we come from? Where are we now? Where do you see us going?
Family violence is generational, and it's cloaked in secrecy until it's not. And we really want to make sure that we are working with our youth on really good interpersonal relationship skills and setting boundaries. We want to make sure that we're working with our teenagers on appropriate relationships and appropriate dating. And we want to make sure that we're working with our families where we know that there's been a history of intimate partner violence. Sadly, we are not seeing a decrease, despite recognizing signs, despite having mandatory reporters in schools, despite having all of the evidence-based programs out there that are available to many of our folks. We are not seeing a decrease in family violence. COVID really brought out the worst in some of our folks who were contained to home. They never had that safety valve of leaving for school or for work. A lot of substance abuse issues bubbled to the top when they didn't have access to what they might have been taking before. And so we really saw an explosion, if you will, of family violence during that time. Since then, we have done our due diligence to get into those families, to work closely with those families, to make sure our advocates are armed with the tools that they need to really try to start kind of repairing all of the progress that we may have made pre-COVID, and to get back to a space where it's something that we are talking about again, something that's manageable, and make sure that our resources are back up and running, because they all too shut down during COVID. So when we needed the resources the most, they were closed.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things I've noticed, especially in the field of medicine, is if you get the diagnosis wrong, then it's pretty sure that your cure is going to be wrong as well. And so whenever I see a situation where we are working, especially in my own personal life, where I'm working on a problem and I'm not really getting the effect or the result that I had anticipated or wanted, it makes me go back to, well, did I diagnose what is the problem or what I'm trying to do? Did I diagnose that correctly? So that brings me to the question about violence is what's what is seen as the major causes of violence now? And I mean, what do we think are those causes?
Well, my lens, of course, is going to be very Native American heavy. And I have spent my career and my life trying to understand generational trauma, what that means and what that looks like and what the symptoms are. I've also really did a deep dive into what unresolved grief looks like. And when you have communities that are full of folks who have experienced their own lifetime with generational trauma, continues to have trauma, were born into a family that had generational trauma, whose grandparents also experienced the generational trauma. The DNA is rewired, how our brain function changes, how we parent changes. And so in the lens that I'm coming to you all with is in rural South Dakota, where we have reservation communities, the root of violence comes from generational trauma and unresolved grief.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And along with that, what would you say, or what you observed is are the catalysts? You know, we say often that and you have to have means, motivation, and opportunity, but part of the ingredients is a catalyst, something that a person can have this underlying grief, but they aren't just in perpetual violence. There's usually something that kicks it off. What kind of things happen that sort of unleash that sort of pent up grief and let's say discomfort?
Well, we have poverty, undescribable poverty. We have third world country basically in South Dakota. When I was a probation officer, it was not uncommon to work with families who did not have running water, who still did not have a good source of electricity. There was one lady in town, as a matter of fact, who had DVDs, and her side job was to rent out portable DVD players. That's how old I am. They were portable DVD players and VCRs in the community, because the poverty was so great that only one person could afford that or whatever. And so when you interlace poverty with years of substance abuse, and you don't have the family structure that we once had, because it has been removed from, and I'm still speaking from a Native American lens, removed from us on purpose. We're left with folks who do not have the skills to identify that they have unresolved trauma and unresolved grief. And if you've ever studied grief, we all, I think there's even jokes about, you're stuck in this stage of grief, or he's stuck in that stage of grief. If you never have a chance to move through it, it just builds. And so anything that's building, whatever that pressure is that's building, from simple mechanics to humans with emotion, what the key is to set it off can be as minor as the car won't start to as major as we lost our job, to our house burned down. I mean, it's very hard to pinpoint what someone's breaking point is when their entire life has been lived without understanding what they're feeling and how to cope with that. Because like you said earlier, if you misdiagnose somebody because of the symptoms that you're seeing, the symptoms that you're treating are not getting any better. In fact, oftentimes worse, especially if you try to use pharmaceuticals because you think they may have this disorder, when in actuality, it has nothing to do with anything chemical. It has everything to do with emotions. And so to answer that question, if I could pinpoint what it was that set somebody off, I think I'd win a Nobel Prize. But in the grand scheme of things, when you have the generational trauma, you have substance abuse, you may have some organic brain damage because you were born to somebody who abused substances. You may have a traumatic brain injury because of the physical abuse that you suffered, or the car accident that you didn't know that caused that. And then you compound it with another person who grew up in the same type of situation. And you have two people then who don't have coping skills, who don't understand what they're feeling, living under the same roof.
One of the things I noticed in some other studies that I was doing is how communities, even of apes, handle, let's say, violence, or how certain situations can make them prone to violence. Things like if everybody is deprived and everybody has this kind of, all the members of that community, they have a certain kind of pressure. They're just uncomfortable. It's like they may have lost track of why they're angry, but there are all kinds of things that daily happen to them that push them to the edge. And then, is there a straw that breaks the camel's back? So I'm trying to paint a scenario to see if you've seen anything like that when you're looking at communities. Have you seen where people, like they're just, let's say, death by 1,000 cuts? It's like lots of little things. We see them in the big picture, but lots of little things that poverty causes. For example, like disappointment that someone didn't do something for you that they even said that they were going to do. And you push it down, but you haven't resolved that, okay, I'll let that go. And even if you, quote, forgive the person, because they told you, you're going to get something, you didn't get it, they're going to do something you didn't do. But those little things, little by little, set you up, seems to set people up for violence. Have you recognized anything that kind of sets people up to be violent?
Well, for sure, disappointment is one. A mild irritation to me, or the ability to say, sometimes doesn't exist, because we're always in flight or fight. When you have a trauma brain and you've been raised in trauma, you were nurtured in trauma, and you're in school where your fellow classmates, and oftentimes some of your teachers, still have that unresolved trauma, your brain remains in flight or fight. And so you're always ready to either run or fight or freeze. And that's just Mother Nature making sure that we survive. Now, are we surviving and thriving? No, but we are surviving. And so when you're in fight or flight all the time, you're constantly ready and waiting for that. You're constantly waiting for that thing that sets you off, that next thing that you need to respond to. You're not calm.
Mhm.
And
It's,
so go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
And as a result, what tips me may not tip her or him. And so we have a real hard time, like I'll use an education setting, when if you have people learning at a different rate or different speed, and one person gets frustrated about writing the number 4 backwards. Um, that exchange could throw off the day for the rest of the class, and nobody's ready to learn anymore because we're dealing with this reaction to a frustration that one would assume he should have the skills to be able to handle.
Right. What it sounds like to me that you're describing in some way is the state of perpetual vigilance, where
100%.
and we know that animals in perpetual vigilance, they don't thrive, they don't do well, they get sick, they're unable to make rational choices for their own good. They seem not to be able to, let's say, to thrive or to function even. Can you give us some examples of that failure to thrive or failure to to cope as a result or connected with perpetual vigilance? And if I'm using words that are unfamiliar, what I mean by perpetual vigilance, in case there's someone who's not heard that term, is when you're always waiting for something to happen. It's like your bow is continuously drawn. You can't let the arrow go, almost for fear that you won't have an arrow in the bow. So you're always perpetually uh, looking out for something, which is one of the states of stress. And animals under stress continuously just don't thrive because of hormonal balances and all the other chemical things that's happening. So I hope that makes it attainable, puts it in a framework where other people who may not have heard that term can understand it. So getting back to our question, have you seen some kind of examples of that?
Oh, for sure. Intimate partner violence that's the state of affairs in that entire family. The partner is always waiting and ready for the other partner to react with violence, and not only to protect their children, but to protect themselves or be tough enough to take whatever it is that's coming. And then the children are always ready and waiting for mom's reaction or dad's reaction so they know what to do. So there's never that calm. And so their state of stress is high. They're ready at all times for the next reaction from whoever is the power and control, whoever is in charge of the violence in that situation. You go to school or you go to work, and your neighbor may be living in the exact same situation. So you've got 2 people now always ready, and then now their kids are always ready. And so when you're constantly in survival mode, it's very hard to memorize the preamble or figure out your fractions because you're still in survival mode. You're worried about literally surviving.
Mhm. We're at a point now where I'd like to stop and give our esteemed audience, guest, and fellow inquisitors time to add something to this conversation. Anybody have any questions, comments, etc., that they would like to contribute? Betty, you have your microphone off. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. As you were, the 2 of you, listening and tossing back and forth some of the terminology and conditions that exist in family violence, um, unresolved grief made me remember that can lead to depression. And then I thought, well, yeah, depression leads to suicide. And those conditions are just omnipresent on the reservations, but not only there. It's really big. And I'm so interested to hear both of you speak more about what we're doing today. It's appreciated.
Vicki?
I had something to say. I came back to South Dakota 25 years ago during the summer. And from what I have noticed, I live in a very rural town, that the most dangerous time for a woman is during harvest. There's a big rush. Everybody's, running around with big machinery. They don't care sometimes if they run over their wife. It seems to be not the point. I've seen that. But for 25 years, I've watched when women are isolated and their husbands supercharged with power all the time. I find that to be amazing, and I find that the other men in the surrounding community may know about any time violence can come, pop out of the family, and it's never reported, and they really don't want to hear about it. And they really don't want you to be involved. They don't want you to come and talk to the woman and say, this is what you can do. But when I first came back 25 years ago, I really kind of was escaping myself. And then I wanted to go to my own hometown where it was safe and everything seemed fine, because I live in Los Angeles, kind of an unsafe area. And then my cousin was murdered by her husband. It was the Tanya Grassel trial. And we kind of knew it might happen, and all the warning signs were there, but we couldn't do anything. And to tell you the truth, I'm so sorry, this is so touchy for me. I don't know that it's changed in 25 years, because I know women in jeopardy. It's the same thing. They're too afraid if you say anything. Also, women that want to get out of the situation on farms because there's so much investment, and the man isn't going to split the property. He'd rather kill the wife. And I don't see, I find that the woman in that condition, if she's been in it long enough, cannot see that she's entrapped, she's imprisoned, and it's a horrible thing. And now it's natural to her. And I find that it's somewhat natural for the surrounding community. Well, there's so much pressure with the crop, and it's got to come in right away, and there's the bankroll, and it's just a dangerous time. All the accidents happen during that time. I would say most, but going to court, watching the denial, trying to prove who did what. But the whole thing of asking a woman to escape, she never really does escape. If she leaves once, she'll be back, and the whole thing. And it's such an unrewarding, for me, area to get involved in. I would stand back and watch now. I would say different things, where help is, and, but I find that once a man says he's going to kill his wife, the percentages go way up. I mean, once the threat is there, that's my understanding from a long time ago. And I don't see a clear pathway where a woman's protected. The only thing that I saw, somebody mentioned me out here, a woman that's in, she has a job for this. She said, you can turn in for senior abuse. If the woman is over 65, there's an avenue that you can turn to for, like everyday abuse, not killing. But I find in 25 years, as I've looked around, nothing's changed. It's a pretty difficult job.
Yeah. Well, I find your fear or concern is well founded, Vicki. And I have to say that at the same time, it is also complicated for almost everybody I talk to who's trying to do, trying to do something. If when I've talked to police about this problem, I think that the consensus is one of the worst calls they like to have, is a
Yes.
domestic violence thing, because we apparently don't have the skills as human beings to know exactly what to do, because they can tell you some weird stories about,
Mhm.
trying to intervene. And it's also interesting that one of the things we often think that men should, like sort of come to the aid, but it seems like we completely discount that men get killed coming to that aid.
Mhm.
And once you get one guy who gets killed and he knows, and other men know about that, well, they think twice before going into a situation where they don't know what the situation is. They don't know either party. Or even if they do, they have a sense of like, hey, it's not my business. Kind of like you were saying, it's like at some point, you don't feel like you have the agency. Whether you do or not, we can discuss. That's another discussion. But the fact is that if that guy doesn't feel that, hey, look, like I can't take on this guy. And yeah, I could call 911, but by the time they get here, she'll probably be dead. What do I do? I think it's more complicated than we give credit for. But that's why I turn to people like Tanya and say, what do we do? I'll throw it at Tanya.
Domestic violence is extremely dangerous. And when this data will show you, it'll take 8 times of a woman trying to leave or leaving and going back before it sticks. On average, it's 8. And so if you're in a small community like the one you described, Vicki, and it's the same sheriff that's been in that community a number of years, as it often is, biases start to form. He starts to think she's going to go back anyway, because she's went back the last 4 times when I came in with guns blazing. Why would I show up with full force this 5th time when I know she's going to stay? And the most dangerous time for a domestic violence survivor is when she does leave, because the abusive partner knows now there's no other options. I might as well kill her or him. And so that's where we come in, making sure that our advocates are armed with all things from the law, from de-escalation skills, to emergency shelter, to transportation, to new cell phones, to new identities, if you will, changing a name without publishing it in the newspaper, being able to access healthcare without using his insurance so he could figure out where she is. Because especially like you said, oftentimes the man has the control of the money, the man has control of the insurance, the man has control of the phones. And so we have come a long way as far as advocacy to be there for when the person's ready to leave. But we can't force them out. We've come a long way in partnering with law enforcement to help address those biases, to talk about emotional intelligence, to talk about responding to a victim who may respond to you back with a trauma brain. And then you don't know who is the primary aggressor, because they're both escalated to here. Both of them appear to be injured. And then South Dakota's law is one should be arrested for safety reasons until that cooling off period, if you will. Who do we take? Who goes? And then it goes all the way down the line to custody. With shared parenting, she now has to face her abuser every time they exchange children, heightening the danger of what's going to happen and what's going to happen in front of my children. Is it easier than to just stay? One of the roles of the membership, or excuse me, one of the roles of the network is we represent our membership. So you can join the network. And then once you join, you get someone like me to come in and talk about cultural responsiveness, de-escalation skills, if you will, funding opportunities. But you also get us to be at the Capitol, to be your eyes and your ears, to let you know what bills will have a ripple effect in how we do our job, what bills will have a ripple effect in how we respond to intimate partner violence, and what bills can impact a sentence, if you will, of an offender. So we are there. We can't lobby. So I'm educating and informing our folks on trends that we're seeing, things that might work. Sadly, and this is not, I shouldn't say it sadly, because it's the Constitution, but the Constitution affords rights that they are innocent until proven guilty. And so all of the law, all of the response, all of the reaction is in favor of the defendant because of the Constitution. Where our victim, there is nothing written specifically in the Constitution that's as easily as interpreted as what we do for our defendants for our victims. So the burden is always on the victim to prove that they are in fact the victim. And so if you've got constitutionalists, if you've got lawyers, if you've got someone who's trained by the law is on the side of the defendant. And so when you have someone trying to escape a violent situation and they then have to prove it, like your friend Tanya, I have no doubt that there were signs all the way up until that instant offense occurred. But how could she prove that? Because she didn't go to the doctor, the injuries weren't recorded, there wasn't a witness that would testify for her. So her day in court would have been he said, she said. And the law is on the side of the defendant, that the burden of proof wasn't shown, that he probably committed that crime. And so here we are. But then biases start happening with our responders to those offenses. So we will always have violence. It's in our nature. Survival of the fittest, the top dog wins, divide and conquer. All of that has been ingrained in our DNA since time began. But recognizing biases, understanding the role of emotional intelligence, responding to situations, knowing that you probably have basically two victims. He was probably victimized and raised in a home like that, so has his own unresolved trauma. And she was probably raised in a home like that where she saw that it was, I don't want to say the norm, but certainly accepted. We have a lot of unpacking to do when it comes to getting into the root of that situation and fixing that, and then preventing it from the next generation to rear its ugly head again.
I think one of the ways that I started to understand the dynamics is switching it from, the male versus female to child versus parent. And you see the difficulty a child would have in, like reporting to the police that they were being abused, and as a former paramedic, I've seen some really horrible cases, kids this one kid, I on the verge of nightmares when I saw this story. His mother was upset because he was urinating still, in his pants or something. And so she put a rubber band on his penis and put him in the closet and didn't feed him, right? So what if you're the brother or sister, who do you go to, and what's the story that you tell to get your mother arrested, right? It's like, that's a hard choice, even though you have another sibling in the house to say, what do you do? They don't know. And I think when I saw it through that lens, I could see, well, okay, this person doesn't want to turn in this abuser, her abuser, because her mind says, well, it was just that time, or I deserved it, or there was some excuse, and she doesn't quite get around to just saying this has to stop, or that maybe it's just hard. And I think that's that's one of the situations that we're facing, is like, it's an individual level, it's hard to come to a solution.
I have one more thing to say. With the women that I have seen, it's almost like if they've been in it so long, they're a little bit kind of crazy themselves from staying vigilant for so long. And you can't tell them that this is normal. They don't see that as abnormal. That's the puzzling thing.
It's constant manipulation. This generation calls it gaslighting. I think when the partner who's got the power and control spins it back to it was you're somehow responsible for their actions.
Yep.
And so the new term is gaslighting. We called it manipulation. But when you've been manipulated and you no longer trust your own judgment because you've been told that it's been incorrect for the majority of your relationship, and then you're hypervigilant because you're waiting for the explosion, and then you still have to go to work. You learn to be dishonest with your coworkers because you don't want them to know what's happening. So your children are raised in situations where dishonesty is okay sometimes. Violence is easily forgiven. And violence sometimes is mom's fault because dad said so, or dad's fault because mom said so. We're raising future abusers. And until we somehow break that cycle. Now, not everyone who was raised in a home turns into an abuser. And not everybody who is raised in an alcoholic home turns into an alcoholic, because they've somehow rooted somewhere. There's something that rooted them and gave them those roots, and there's somebody else in their life that raised the expectations for their behaviors. We start accepting those behaviors, we'll get what we expect. But there are people, oftentimes those angels show up in the most opportune way. Sometimes it's on purpose. It's a teacher. Sometimes it's an accident. It's somebody at church. But there's somebody that raises the expectation for something, and that child then recognizes that they can do more. They can do more. The expectation is that they can do more, not that they stay in the situation like that. And so when I tell my personal story about being raised on the reservation by a single mother and the trauma that I've been able to survive, that's often the question. What made your life different from your cousin down the street? And the answer always is, I was rooted because of my grandparents' influence. And the expectations were that I would do better. I was never was it said, if you go to college. It was when. And the expectation was I would learn how to play piano, call for partner pitch, and go and learn how to go to school. There was no wiggle room with my grandparents. My mother, on the other hand, who was raised in a very violent home and who has a learning disability, her expectations were C's. I worked my tail off and I ended up with C's. So if you guys get C's, great. When we excelled, she's still surprised. And genuinely, I'm her daughter. I'm 54 years old, and my mom is still genuinely surprised that I can learn the way that I can learn, or that I can speak the way that I can speak, because of what the expectations were for her and what was her life. Thank goodness I had grandparents who had expectations. Thank goodness I had teachers who saw something in me. But when you're little and you've got those behaviors, and I can tell you, the best teachers, the best guidance counselors, you get wore down, you get tired. And if you're seeing the same behaviors all the time, it's easier to send that student off. Your expectations are low because you know the next day is going to be a repeat. And that's why our job is not only to make sure that the person who experienced the violence has the tools and the access to get out and the supports that they need, but that we're working with the pumpkins to make sure that they have what they need to overcome what they've been raised with thus far. And oftentimes it's hard. It's very hard, but it takes all of us. So my team is not your traditional looking team for a domestic violence person. If someone who works in that field, my team includes birth to 3. My team includes nurses. My team includes judges who write codes for truancy. So if the kid is truant, why is the kid truant? My work includes working with human trafficking task force. Who's the most vulnerable? that's who the human traffickers are after. That's who the drug dealers are after, is the most vulnerable ones, the ones who absolutely need the shoes, who need the phone. So our team is huge, our net is wide, and we have constant communication to help identify these families and put in place what we need to catch them when they're ready, what the community has available to support them when they're ready. Like I think Betty said, and I think Vicky said, we can't drag them out. We can't use any magical powers to will them out. We just have to be ready when they are, and have those supports and those services ready to catch them and their family, all of them. So that's my role, is to make sure that I'm constantly ensuring that what I've started can be enhanced, that it's not just dose education saying, okay, here's a tool and then leave and never come back again. I want to make sure that I'm there to reinforce, to be sustainable, and to make sure that that safety net is always there, regardless of if we have COVID again, regardless of if that grant ends. It needs to be sustainable.
No,
One more quick question.
Sure.
What, let's say 100% of women that have been abused, what percentage of those women would you say escape the situation and are renewed and can live a normal life?
Well, that's a loaded question. And it all depends on their supports. If a woman simply changes addresses, that's just geography. And so her trauma follows her to the next spot. And sadly, trauma rides for free. If we take the time to really address, and she can identify, or he can identify, that they were victims and not culpable in that role, and that they have healing to do as opposed to responsibility to take, the scores go up for success stories. If they continue to believe that they had a role in that they deserve that, or that they don't address any of it and simply move from 8th Street to 4th Street, trauma rights for free, and they will more than likely be re-victimized.
All of us have been talking really about the response to violence. And you mentioned earlier, Tanya, that that you felt that was in our DNA. And I don't know that there's any place in the world that we can go that there are humans, that there are no incidents of violence. But I have lived in places where these kind of discussions are like, huh? And when you live with those people, you don't see, for example, fights in the street. You go to bars and people are all drunk, and you don't see people fighting, and you certainly don't see people having shootouts. Even among the children, there are almost no incidents of violence, and people are just completely amazed when it happens because it's so rare. Clearly, our society is not one of those societies. And so my question starts to be to myself and to my fellow Americans, what is it that we're doing that's different than what other people are doing? What can we learn from them before we have the intervention and we have to find somebody, we find a victim and a perpetrator? Before we get to victim say, what can we do that that doesn't lead to that particular juncture? Does that make sense?
The answer is culture. Whoever you're talking about was allowed to live with their culture, within their norms, and that was set up a long time ago, and it wasn't disrupted. While you can look at the culture of Native Americans and you can say that we were warring tribes, that was for resources to save our family. It wasn't to wipe out or terminate or exterminate another tribe. It was to maintain the status quo when it came to food and shelter for our families. That was warring back then. What we're seeing now is a bunch of folks whose culture was stripped. We were not able to practice our own religion until my lifetime. My mom was at risk of being taken from her home to put into a boarding school because of the idea of, say the child killed the Indian. Those programs were alive and well in my generation. And so now we can practice the religion that was truly ours and not somebody else's that they thought we should practice. Now we can speak a language that was truly ours. We can wear our hair traditionally, and we can embrace our culture. But to implement that, when we're still fighting these other things, right? Historical trauma, generational trauma, PTSD, all of those things, substance abuse, has been a slippery slope. And one of the reasons is if you're dependent upon grants, and I think I saw something over here about available and affordable counseling. If you are in a poverty-stricken area, or if you're even in pure South Dakota, counseling is one, there's a waiting list of about 3 months. 2, if you don't have insurance, I don't know who could afford it. It's super expensive. So if you're relying on a grant, like a behavioral health grant that showed up in your community, they want to see evidence-based. They want to see that they're getting their money's worth for investing into that program. How do you derive evidence from cultural beliefs? How do you derive evidence from prayer? How do you get evidence from forgiveness, or a ceremony of ours would be called wiping of the tears? How do you put that on a piece of paper and make that be evidence-based? So it's taken to the year 2022, 2022, where the CDC finally said, we need to listen to the people who know how to live without violence. What did you do? What works? How did you make it work? You tell us what works. I could sit here in Atlanta, Georgia, and come up with the best de-escalation program on earth, and you can indigenize it, or you could develop your own programs surrounding your cultural beliefs, your religious beliefs, your practices, so you're rooted, so there's expectations, so there's roles, so that you understand your role as a man in the relationship, so you understand your role as the woman in the relationship, so that the grandparents or the elders understand their role. That's the key, is those communities that have managed to live a life where they've managed their violence, or it doesn't exist because of their culture. It's because they've been able to retain that. Now, the United States has how many cultures here? And a lot of the cultures that came here didn't bring a lot of that with them. Like, I'm half Native. My grandmother is my dad on my dad's side, that's non-Native, obviously Grassel-Krietlow. I have the most white name for a Native American on earth. No one knows what I am. But anyway, the Grassel side is Irish and German. We did not have one German meal when I was growing up. We did not have one Irish meal. In fact, I'd have to Google it. Other than, if it wasn't for TV, I would have no idea what that looked like. But we did have traditional Native meals. But my grandparents' ancestors, when they came here, adapted and kind of shed what they left behind, and just kind of grew into their own culture, with that be farming or Catholicism or what that looked like. But they didn't bring any of their historical traditions with them. I would argue that the people that you're talking to have a lot of their historical traditions with them, that they remember that there's a culture base, that there's a root, that there's something lovely that they could fall back on or build upon. But when you've taken the rug out from so many cultures and you've kind of mushed them all together, it's very hard to figure out where that steady is and where that platform is.
Well, that brings me to a question, and we're really sort of barreling right down to the end of our time here. But it brings me to, I think, is a kind of a critical question, is, can you give us some of the things that those traditional cultures use, that Native cultures use, that sort of created the atmosphere of using other solutions other than violence to solve human interactions?
Oh, absolutely. We relied heavily on our elders. Our elders had the experience and the wisdom and storytelling. Some cultures call them fables, some cultures call them, there's all 1,000 different names for that storytelling to implement those kinds of lessons. Everybody had very distinct roles. Your role is the seed keeper. Your role is the hunter. Your role is the akichita to protect us, the warrior. Your role is the horses. Your role is the fishing. Everybody knew from when they were little on up what their role was. They had somebody overseeing those elders on how to perfect those roles. And then you had the other roles of being a father, being a provider, being a wife, being a mother, nurture. It was all in part of it. Now, if you stepped out of that, because free will, we're humans, you would be, we used shame. I know, we would like embarrass them on purpose. Worst case scenario, admonishment or banishment. And so if you were ever to go to Fort Thompson, South Dakota, the town itself is called Fort Thompson. There's a little area over here that is lovingly called Bad Nation. We didn't kick them out. We didn't want them to die, but they had to go over here until their behaviors were good enough for them to come back to the community. So we had all of that stuff in place. And then through colonization, of course, we didn't, and then we couldn't, and now we can. So when trying to put it back together is where we're at right now.
Great. Any other last questions from anyone? We only have about 4 minutes, but anybody? Well, I want to introduce one other thing that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, or somewhere in our communications, the collaborative change model.
Oh,
You're familiar with that, I think. And I guess the straight to the point question is it working, and where can we get, what is it? Is it working, and where can we get more information about it?
the collaborative change model is working because it is when you think about considerations, you first have to listen and accept, right? And so this is a collaborative way to listen to what the issues are, accept the voice that's coming to you, and then work together for the solution. And it's both of the people. If it's a family, it's all of the family. If it's a couple, it's both. And so it's not just me going off to counseling because I've been abused. It's the person who laid hands on me that comes with me. It's not me that just goes, it's my children who experience the violence. So it's a whole collaboration and a collection. But you have to be able to, as a professional, set aside all of your teachings, all of your biases, and learn from the person coming in so that we together can come up with a solution to move forward. Because some practices don't work for me. Some practices won't work for you. Some of it all is going to be cognitive. Some of it's going to be emotion. Some of it's going to be grief. And so that model is one of the newer ways of looking at counseling. So instead of laying on a couch and being told exactly what's wrong with you based on your admissions, it is all of us coming together to talk about what happened in this unit and how we can move forward.
Well, I'm sure that this is going to be a very interesting journey. One of the things that I found when I'm talking to people about these kinds of things, and I'm involved in alternatives to violence, is that often people don't even have the language to talk about that trauma that you were talking about earlier. They don't have the words to say, this is where I hurt. And it's like a phantom limb, is that they know that they're experiencing pain, but the person on the outside is saying, how could you be hurting there when you don't even have that arm? But to them, it's as real as if the arm is there. And they don't know how to say that. What do you say to someone, if you have a missing limb and they say your hand can't possibly itch because there's no hand there? What's the conversation you have? And I think that happens a lot with the whole issue of grief as well, and that kind of trauma. It's like, trying to find a way to actually have a conversation so that people can help you, so that you can be heard, can be really hard. Thank you, Tanya, for your time here. I want to remind our esteemed guests that in the chat you can, right next to the little smiley face, you can download by clicking on the three buttons and download any kind of links, etc., that Colby has so graciously put in the chat. Want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you very much again, Tanya, for your contribution to this very important topic. Thank you all, and see you next week, same time, same station.